This is my favorite movie of our Lord and Saviors, aka Mike Flanagan's. Let's do it. I did a super intense deep dive of this movie and The Shining on my podcast, by the way, if you're interested. So, Dr. Sleep opens up in 1980, and we meet this little girl named Violet. Violet makes the mistake of wandering off into the woods where she encounters Rose the Hat, who is going to be one of our main characters. And Rose and crew attack and eventually this little girl. Also in 1980, we meet Wendy and Danny Torrance. Wendy and Danny are trying to recover from their trauma that happened to them at the Overlook Hotel, of course, we know from The Shining. And we see that Danny is still being haunted by the ghosts of the Overlook. But one day, little Danny sees the spirit of Dick Halloran, who teaches him a trick to get rid of these ghosts. And he teaches Danny to lock them up in a box inside of his head. So then we jump to 2011, where we meet an adult Danny, now going by Dan, and we see he, like his father, has become an alcoholic. We see him wake up next to this woman who is passed out in bed and her young child is there. And later on we learn that the two of them died and he just left her. So this kind of wakes him up and he moves to New Hampshire for a fresh start. And he meets Billy, who sets him up with a job and an apartment. And Billy also introduces Dan to Alcoholics Anonymous. Danny gets a job as an orderly working at a hospital where he gets the nickname Dr. Sleep. Now, we know from the Shining movie that Dan shines, meaning he has this psychic ability. And he, along with this cat Azrael, are able to foresee when patients are going to die. And Dan uses this gift to comfort the patients as they pass away. In 2011, we also meet this young girl named Abra, who also seems to be able to shine. And her parents learn this about her at a young age. And she begins to telepathically communicate with Dan through this chalkboard in his apartment. While this is all happening, we learn more about Rose the Hat and her group, who is called the True Knot. Rose the Hat and her lover Crow Daddy are scoping out prospective people. And they find this girl named Snakebite Andy who has the ability to push, meaning she'll say sleep and the person falls asleep. And they take her and they turn her to become one of them. So basically this group is this immortal cult, and they survive off the steam of children. But these children have to have the ability to shine. And this is why they went after little Violet in the beginning. And they put their steam in a canister and feed off of it, which keeps them living pretty much forever. And the way they get the steam from the children is causing fear and pain. So we cut to 2019, Dan is 8 years sober, Abra is a teenager now, and the True Knot is still all the same ages that they were in fucking 1980, and they're still going after kids. One day this group is drawn to this boy named Bradley, who we refer to as the baseball boy, because he shines. And in one of the most traumatic scenes ever, they violently off him and take his steam. And it's so violent that Abra wakes up screaming as it happens. So she's telepathically connected to it and she knows that there's this group. So she telepathically alerts Dan, who she now refers to as Uncle Dan. They're still writing back and forth on the chalkboard. So Abra tries to look in through Rose to see where this group is, where they're going. And one day while grocery shopping, Abra is able to telepathically put herself inside of Rose's mind, but Rose catches her. And Rose tells Crow Daddy there's this girl who knows about us. She has the biggest steam I've ever seen. We need to have her. So now their goal is to make Abra their next victim. So Rose one night astral projects and manages to get into Abra's mind. But it turns out it's a fucking trap and Abra injures her, but then is also able to get in her mind to see her memories and learn more about the cult. However, through getting in her mind, Rose now knows where Abra is. So she sends the members of the True Knot to go get her. Now, Abra and Dan haven't even physically met in person at this point, but Abra seeks him out and finds him. She tells Dan all about the baseball boy and is like, I know where they buried him. If you go and get his baseball glove and bring it back for me to touch, I can find out more about this group. So Dan recruits his best friend Billy and they set out to Iowa to go dig up this kid's body, which they do find. So they go back to Abra's with the glove where they meet Abra's father, who thinks they're just fucking creeps. So Abra has to project these images of the baseball kid and of the group into her father for him to understand, and he does. So Abra, her father, Billy, and Dan set up this plan. And they set up this operation where they lead the True Knot to this specific area in the woods, making them think that Abra is there. But she's not, and as they realize that, Danny and Billy start shooting from the tree line and taking them all out. This bitch Andy, as she's dying, looks at Billy and tells him to kill himself. And remember, she can push, so he does it. This is one of the saddest deaths in movie history, I don't care. Billy deserved better. Abra, who's looking in on this from the safety of her own home, realizes that Crow Daddy isn't there. And sure enough, she wakes up to find Crow Daddy in her house killing her father. And he kidnaps Abra and takes her to drive her to Rose the Hat. Dan, however, is able to telepathically take over Abra as she's in the car with Crow Daddy. And he, as Abra, crashes the car, which then causes Crow Daddy to fly out the windshield and die. So now Rose is literally the only True Knot member left, and she is fucking pissed. And Dan knows Rose is going to be coming for them. So he picks up Abra and takes her to the one place that he knows is very dangerous for people like them, including Rose the Hat. And that is the Overlook Hotel, which is now abandoned. So Dan knows he has to go inside and wake it up. So he enters the hotel and he goes to the boiler room, and he sets the temperature purposely for it to overload. And he wanders through the hotel seeing everything for the first time since he was a child. Mind you, they literally took the blueprints from Stanley Kubrick's original set, so it's an exact replica. Danny, like his father, eventually makes his way to the bar, where he is confronted by the spirit of his father, Jack Torrance. But Danny is able to be stronger than his father was, and he refuses to take a drink. So Rose the Hat arrives and confronts Abra and Dan. But they have a trick up their sleeve, and they get in her head and send her into this snowy hedge maze, which of course we recognize from The Shining. So Abra attacks Rose and they try to lock her in one of Danny's lock boxes. But she sees what they're doing before they're able to do it, and she wakes up and snaps out of it, so it doesn't work. So she goes after Dan in this scene that mirrors The Shining, where Rose the Hat is Jack Torrance following Wendy up the stairs, who is now Dan. Rose hurts Dan with the axe, which causes him to fall down the stairs, and she gets on top of him and starts to take his steam from him. And she tells him, "I don't know how you got away from us as a kid, because as an adult, the steam gets corrupted, so it's not as good. That's why we go after children." But it's at this point that Dan looks at Rose the Hat and is like, "There's something that you don't know about this hotel. There are spirits here that are dangerous for people like us, and they're starving." And we see all of the little lockboxes in his head being opened. And all the spirits from the hotel come back and attack Rose. And they feed on her steam and kill her. But then, of course, it can't just end there because they have to set their attention on Dan. The spirits of the hotel possess Dan, which causes him to go after Abra with an axe. So now, again, he has become his father. When he finally corners Abra, Dan is able to have the power to come through and be himself for a moment, long enough for Abra to run away. And then Dan is possessed to go to the boiler room, and the hotel tries to possess him to turn the boiler off. But he once again regains control and he stands back, and he watches as the boiler explodes. As the fire starts to blaze around him, he has this vision where he becomes a child again, and he is comforted by his mother. And meanwhile, Abra escapes and looks on as the Overlook burns to the ground. Sometime later, we see Abra back at home in her bedroom, and she's speaking to somebody. And the camera pans and we see that she's speaking to Dan. But Abra's mom comes in the room and Dan disappears, so he's not there. He did die in the blast at the hotel, but he still visits Abra, kind of like Dick Halloran visited him as a kid throughout his life. Abra tells her mother that after we die, we go on, and Dan is fine, and so is Dad. The final scene is Abra looking at her bathroom and seeing the woman in the bathtub from The Shining, which we saw child Danny see earlier. And she goes in the bathroom and closes the door so she can lock her away in a lockbox like Dan taught her, and the movie ends.